while ago I did a three-part series that you guys should check out. It's pretty good. It goes over all of Hong Kong's history, sort of where how it got to where it is, why it became wealthy, how much of it was colonialism, how much of it was China, how much of it was the times. Just a really good sort of way to get a handle on what that city is really about as it begins to evolve into something very, very different. So for the last since 2019, Hong Kong has been in the crosshairs of the Chinese Communist Party, and for good reason from their perspective, because Hong Kong is extremely dangerous to the party's control. And anybody who's been to Hong Kong or who's got a handle on what's going on in China can see that pretty easily. There's just the idea that you can have a democratic city state just sort of sitting as a little appendage on the southern Chinese coast is about as far from ideal from a Chinese political regime's perspective as you can get. There's almost nothing its history says is a worse idea, but during the last 50 years, China kind of needed it. It needed the resources. It needed the global middleman role that Hong Kong played, and that's kind of what happened. But now we're in a very different stage of history. So we're starting to see things like what would have happened over the last 2 months, really. So we had a new election law in May. It's just another move to just limit again the public control, public authority, local control, local authority in Hong Kong. We have the Chinese the Chinese military, Chinese state security. They're all in Hong Kong now, and people are starting to feel it. So there's the sort of relatively well-known media executive Jimmy Lai was just sort of expropriated, I guess you could say, which we should get ready and just get ready to see a lot more of because it's happening. It's definitely where things are going, and censorship has increased. Basically, all of the things that go with a tightening of political control are starting to happen, and yeah, I mean this is what we got to get ready for. So what this little live stream is supposed to do is just give a quick update on what's going on, and then also just sort of remind people how we should be interpreting these events, because you don't want to get caught in just thinking, oh my God, it's another attack, it's another assault on democracy, it's another whatever the media is going to spin it as. This is part of a pretty methodical process of just what I like to just call flattening Hong Kong. Not like physically flattening it or sort of materially flattening it, but making it indistinguishable from the rest of its local region. And that's really the goal. Hong Kong's identity, its independent history, its independent idea that it had independent wealth, independent everything, its colonial past, all this is extremely dangerous from the party's perspective, and the time has really come to put an end to it. So that's what we're seeing, and it's modulated, like the speed at which this happens, it depends on China's perception of how the outside, the Western world, outside world sees it, other developing countries, its need for external markets and sort of international recognition, and all these things are sort of helping to decide how quickly it's going to move. But the overall trajectory, the trend, is definitely to do exactly what everyone's kind of wondered would happen since 1997. Like, is Hong Kong going to be a unique, independent, quasi-Chinese, mostly Chinese, partially Western place, or is it going to be like the rest of mainland China? And the answer is, from the party, if the party has its way, it's definitely going to be as much like mainland China as it can make it. So for when this really started to come out, when the new national security law came out a few months ago, the media was sort of trying to figure out what was happening, and it wasn't really giving people the full sweep, the full context for what we should expect and what we are really seeing. And what all this really meant was the beginning of this major tightening on Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is one of those places, it's a financial center, so a lot of the media questions and a lot of the sort of indecision about what's going on is coming from the financial firms in that city. So these companies do not want to leave unless they're forced. They have long ties, long history. A lot of them are really reliant on Hong Kong. Companies like HSBC, they're really going to suffer if something bad happens to Hong Kong, or their unique positioning is really going to be challenged. There's all sorts of like minor economic banking sort of things going on that are coloring this, but people weren't really trying to get the heart of what this means. It means that if you're a Western company in Hong Kong, you consider that to be your base of operations in South China, Southern China, or China in general, or that whole region. time to start moving. It's time to start thinking that you should do something else, and that's what we see today. I mean, so the U.S. Chamber of Commerce did a survey of American businesses in Hong Kong. 42% of them are planning to leave or thinking about leaving, and this is probably underselling it. They're dealing with their shareholders and all these different things, so they actually can't even give you an honest account of what they're really thinking. As always with corporations, there's like a weird, muddled corporate PR speak that just like kind of infiltrates everything. But yeah, that's a really high number if that's what we're seeing with the PR already accounted for. So yeah, so people are trying to move, and we're seeing it in the sort of economics of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has extremely high housing prices because it's very land constrained. They build up mountainsides because they don't have a lot of flat land. Rent is extremely expensive. People pay like almost $1 million for a parking space in Hong Kong. They have like one of the smallest square footage apartments anywhere. It's crazy. They look like shoeboxes basically. A lot of them. It's pretty awful for someone from America who's used to more space. Although if you've lived in New York and other places, you're really not that far off. But I mean, you're pretty far off. I mean, this is really bad. I wish I'll bring up another time. Maybe I'll bring up a picture of one of these apartments. You can just look it up. Just Google like average Hong Kong apartment like that. I think it's like 250, 300 square feet, maybe something like that. Pretty crazy. But the rents, I mean, the vacancy rate for the commercial real estate is the lowest it's been, I believe, in years. No, the commercial vacancy in 2021 is the highest it's ever been, right? So the number of occupancies vacancies are the highest ever, and 80% of those vacancies come from international companies because international companies are the ones that are really threatened. It's kind of different. Like Hong Kong physically will look very similar for a long time because China wants to keep up the image. This is this thing where even if it's transforming, flattening, making Hong Kong indistinguishable, it also wants to do it in a beautiful way, or a way that keeps the look, keeps the image that it wants to project both to the outside world and to domestic, Chinese audiences, which are actually very different. Like the domestic Chinese mainland audience, they don't think that well of Hong Kong. So, but for the outside world, China really wants to maintain this image of Hong Kong being exactly what it is. But this ability, it doesn't really have much of a capacity to do that because the rhetoric and the media buzz around Hong Kong is so bad. Ever since the NBA fiasco a couple of years ago, it's just been spiraling downhill, and all the national security laws, all this has made the image of China and Hong Kong really the worst it's ever been. So people know what's going on, but China is going to be moving in companies as international companies move out. Mainland companies will move in, and some of that might just be real economic decisions that like it gives them prestige or whatever it happens to be. But it'll also maintain the image from the national government's perspective. They're going to be able to make it seem like, some people, it's just natural economic processes. Some people are moving in, some people are moving out. It's just like people in the U.S. moving from San Francisco to anywhere else during the pandemic. Except it's not really going to be like that. It's going to be a fundamental transition of the basic economic structure of Hong Kong, which is meant to be a borderland. It's meant to be an entrepot, a middleman zone where that's where East and West sort of met, and the British colonial past, colonial infrastructure gave Hong Kong the ability to interface with the West and with China, and did it in such a way that, well, it facilitated Chinese growth, the financial flows, and the export-driven industrialization of the Pearl River Delta. But also that interface was, it was a bit more than that. It was also a sort of tense, uncomfortable thing from the beginning. So it facilitated all this action, but it was also something that goes against the entire grain of Chinese history and of Chinese culture. And no one wanted a colony to be as useful and impactful as it was, but that's kind of the way it played out. And then Hong Kong ended up becoming incredibly wealthy as a part of it. And so all of this creates a different narrative than how China sees its history. So China wants, the mainland government wants the Chinese people and the world to think that it was, the Communist Party that brought China out of poverty and modernized it, which is true. Definitely true in a lot of ways, but it was also the times. It was also really a major role was played by the old colonial appendage of Hong Kong, and that gave it its own history, its own wealth, its own identity, and all of that really just has to go now. And so that's what Hong Kong is really looking at. So when you're seeing stories about, whether they talk about how Britain is trying to help the Chinese, basically treating them like refugees or something. Like, oh, you're having to flee a totalitarian state. Yes, that's true, but also Britain. I mean, we live in a very cutthroat world right now. That Britain is just trying to grab as many rich Hong Kong people as possible to suck it into its economy because it's going to be struggling. So that's one of those things where Hong Kong is extremely wealthy. It doesn't create the same sort of humanitarian animus as a lot of like poverty situations you see in Southeast Asia or Africa or Central America or wherever you want to look at. Basically, it's everywhere. But it does create this sort of this democratic and the anti-totalitarian impulse. So you don't have the poverty. You don't look at Hong Kong like, wow, like terrible poverty. Look what China's done to it. But you do see, wow, look at how these, their liberties are being trampled on, their economic freedoms, etc. That's sort of where the push comes, but it's not as strong. So Hong Kong just falls out of the news because, I mean, it's ultimately like something like New York City. Oh, New York City is having trouble with Albany or something like that. It's still an extremely wealthy place where it is definitely being pulled into different narratives in the West about how to combat China. It's let's stand up for Hong Kong, but really you don't want to stand up for Hong Kong. No one, unfortunately, in the West, no one really cares about Hong Kong in the way they pretend they do. And I think that's a big reason China's able to move as strongly as it has been. I think that in the EU and sort of in Europe, they don't really quite know what to do with any of this. And in the West, it's just a question of, are you going to push? I mean, in the U.S., are you going to push China on every single thing? Increasingly, yes. But the Hong Kong one, people in the West, different countries, anyone outside of China doesn't really have the ability to impact this situation. Everything you do to try and restore freedoms to Hong Kong or restore their liberties is just going to make life worse for them. Like we can't do anything to make life better for people in Hong Kong. Like, how do we say it? Like, if you can't be a borderland, then Hong Kong can't really be in the way it's ever been. And you can't sort of give them new privileges or give them new rights or give them new access. It's just going to be feeding China. So now that if Hong Kong got wealthy and would continue to be wealthy by being this interface, well, what if the West doesn't want to interface with China in the same way? It's sort of a fundamental break here. And so a lot of people, I mean, there's major capital flight out of Hong Kong now, like the rest of China, and that's something that the Chinese government is also trying to tamp down with a lot of its different laws. But yeah, this is the way things are going, and it's really a microcosm of what we're going to see, well, across southern China, most likely in the next few years, next decade. But this has huge impacts for what happens with Taiwan. I mean, Hong Kong was supposed to be the trial run for how a potential peaceful unification of Taiwan was going to happen. Well, that's never going to happen now. That's just, if this is what it looks like, Hong Kong, you're not going to be able to convince anyone in Hong Kong to do, and in Taiwan to go through something like what Hong Kong is going through. So that ship has kind of sailed, and it's probably not getting enough airtime in sort of just typical Western media. Like that ship has sailed. There is no way you're going to get a Taiwanese government to get over 50% that's going to try and electoral votes to be able to convince anyone that there's going to be a peaceful unification with China. So we're not talking about a lot of things with China because, kind of like the virus, like the potential that there was a Wuhan lab leak, there are so many things that just seem to have the potential to spiral relations with China to some terrible, terrible place, which is, it's kind of where things are going. But at every level, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the virus, people are trying to keep it from getting completely out of control because there's a very big fear of like what really would happen. And well, it's probably not going to be good. And I mean, getting back to Hong Kong really quick, 40,000 people left this year. That's the most, one of only 2 years. It's the most that people have left since 1997. And yeah, I mean, I think people should just be ready for Hong Kong to transform. I mean, I first entered China. The first time I ever went there, I entered through Hong Kong, and that's really something that's very common for a lot of people. It is part of that colonial heritage, though. There's a reason why that's the case. Maybe it's not good. Maybe there's a major historical thing that we could talk about. But where things are going with Hong Kong are not going to be anybody's idea of a paradise. And you should really look at all these news stories and everything that people are saying about Hong Kong and where it's going and what businesses are doing and what's happening with the government and what's happening with Chinese integration with the broader region into the sort of Pearl River, what do they call it, the Greater Bay Area. All of these things, they should be seen as part of a deliberate attempt to make Hong Kong indistinguishable, make it as Chinese as possible, bring it back into the fold as much as possible. And what that's going to mean is probably what the business that should have been in Hong Kong is going to Singapore if it's leaving, maybe a little bit of Tokyo, and then the rest will be probably, if it's still going to be mainland Chinese business, it's moving to Shanghai. So China, I mean, Hong Kong never had the chance to, it never had the potential to really outcompete Shanghai in mainland China. Kind of go over that in the series I made. It's a good point just because it really explains kind of the internal dynamics of China. And once it loses this borderland status, it's not going to have a role at all. So hope you enjoyed this video, this quick live stream, and I'll do another one